Welcome to Gwinnett County Public Library. My name is Amy Perry, and I'm an adult services specialist with the library. Thank you for joining our program, Lukya, Understanding the Cultural Roots of the Gullah Geechee. Now, let me introduce our presenter. Dr. Jessica Berry is an educator, advocate, and researcher who is passionate about sharing the living Gullah Geechee history, culture, and language with the world. She is an assistant professor of speech pathology and audiology at South Carolina State University. She's also the owner of J. Berry Collective, a consulting agency who specializes in educating others on the importance of preserving regional languages. Dr. Berry is also an author. The Little Gullah Geechee Book, A Guide for the Kamya. And she'll speak about this and other things relating to the Gullah Geechee in tonight's program. Please welcome Dr. Jessica Berry.
Welcome. I'm glad to see you tonight in this short presentation. We're going to talk a little bit about my beloved Gullah Geechee language and culture. As she stated, the presentation is titled Lukya, Understanding the Cultural Roots of Gullah Geechee. I have to share a thank you to the Gwinnett County Public Library for extending this invitation to me tonight to share with you just a little bit about our culture. The objectives today are to discuss Gullah Geechee history, culture, people, and to share some resources. So I'd like to start out with the question, why Gullah? Why now? People like to question, why are we interested in this topic? Charleston and other areas are, especially Charleston, and I like to focus on Charleston because people associate Gullah in particular with Charleston and the Sea Islands. It's one of the fastest growing metropolitan areas in the U.S. There are 34 net new people moving per year, and the largest demographic is those between the ages of 25 and 34 years old. The number one highest concentration in the U.S. Not only in Charleston, but in many of the Gullah Geechee areas, a lot of these spaces are gentrifying. What does that mean? People that are not from the area are coming in and moving in. And what that does is it takes away, in some instances, from the natives of the area and the culture. But more importantly, I think, why Gullah, why now, is because we have the nation's attention. There are several laws going into place. There is work being done on climate and land and agriculture. We are being showcased on national TV via CNN, Hulu with United Shades of America with WK Mobile, and Taste the Nation with Padma Lakshmi, among others. Gullah is a hot topic right now because I think many people are recognizing the importance of preserving the culture and language. So rather than asking the question, why Gullah, why now? I ask, why not Gullah? Why not now? I think the time has long passed for us to take moments like this that the Gwinnett County Public Library have afforded to share what Gullah is with others, and in many ways motivate them to go out on their own, do their research, read the books that are out there. So Gullah is a world English variety. In linguistics, we share this circle of world Englishes. And right there under American Standard English, Gullah falls somewhere between Black Vernacular English, African American English, Appalachian English, among other American Standard English dialects. Gullah is one of them. It's actually a language. And I like to start out with that because sometimes people consider Gullah broken English, and it's not. It's situated with the world Englishes. Now, when we talk about Gullah, we have to talk about a perspective of Gullah that hasn't always been very positive, or for that matter, very known. That's me when I was a little girl growing up in Hughie, South Carolina. I put a pin in it because you can see that it's situated right there in the Francis Marion National Forest near Charleston. And when I was this little girl, Gullah Geechee didn't have a name. No one talked to me about being Gullah Geechee. No one told me that I spoke a language. That wasn't a part of our vocabulary. So when I go back to that question, why not Gullah? Why not now? I think about the little girl who was me, who wished someone would have had a webinar. Of course, we didn't have webinars back then, but webinars, sessions, opportunities for me to learn about who I am as a person that identifies as Gullah Geechee. But over the years, the perspectives on Gullah Geechee have shifted. My granddad used to tell me stories about when he was young and he would get spanked for speaking the language, when people would consider Gullah Geechee people as uneducated, that we spoke broken English. Well, I just shared Gullah Geechee is recognized as a world English. And so from that negative perspective that has lingered and persisted for years, the perspective has shifted to, or is moving toward, I'll say that, a more positive image of Gullah Geechee people as we take the national and international stage with our advocacy efforts and opportunities to share about the culture. We're on national TV. There are several social media accounts. There are films that have been and are being made to celebrate our culture. I'd love to see us move. And I think with talks like this, we get to move towards being accepted. Inclusion in curriculum and instruction, recognition and support, funding, opportunities for accommodations for our kids who are in school who speak this language and may need additional assistance. So now that I've made the case for, why Gullah, why now? Why is this important? Why should we take 45 minutes out of our evening to talk about this language and culture? It's because Gullah Geechee is so resilient. We have endured a lot. And so I want to spend the bulk of the time really diving into who we are. I am not a historian. I'm a speech language pathologist and a linguist. So I will spend most of my time talking about the language. But when I introduce what Gullah is, I never say that it is just the people, or it's just the culture, or it's just the language. It is all of those things wrapped up into one. When you hear Gullah Geechee, you think about the Gullah Geechee people that inhabit the land, the culture that we've been able to preserve over centuries, and then the language that has also persisted and we still hear today. Something interesting, or really not interesting, but a historical fact, if you will, is that there were Africans who were living in Sierra Leone, the Windward Coast, the Gold Coast, and they had created systems to cultivate Carolina gold rice. These systems were in practice, these people were living their lives, and they were unfortunately brought into what we know as the transatlantic slave trade. During this process, they were taken from their homes, taken from the spaces that they occupied and that they knew, and they were transported across the Atlantic Ocean over to North America, what we now know are the United States of America. This was not a cruise. This was not a pleasant trip. And the number of people who boarded were not the same amount of people who got off. There was death associated with this transport of people. But the transport of people was because these people were valuable. They landed here, and the history books tell us that about 40% of those Africans landed in Charleston, South Carolina. So in 2006, Representative James Clyburn commissioned the Gullah Geechee Cultural Heritage Corridor, funded this entity that was created to help preserve Gullah Geechee landmarks, culture, history, and language. The corridor, now identified from the coast to about 30 miles inland, starts from North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. In these areas, the commission currently works to bring awareness about what Gullah is, efforts to preserve Gullah culture, language, and history across the corridor. And you can see right there, Berkeley County, that's where I grew up. And it's closer to the inland area, but still very much Gullah Geechee. When we were brought here, as I mentioned, we were brought for our knowledge and our engineering of rice cultivation. This is a picture courtesy of the Library of Congress of a rice field at Mulberry Plantation near Moncks Corner in Berkeley County. And so this engineered system we brought with us from Africa. And so in that vein, what we know about Gullah Geechee people is that they didn't take slaves. They were enslaved. They took people who had lots of knowledge, who were practicing as doctors, lawyers, botanists, chemists, dentists, teachers, engineers, you name it. They probably didn't have those titles, but this is who they were. These photos, the last one is a bill of sale courtesy of the Avery Research Center. And this one is also courtesy of the Avery Research Center of an enslaved African woman in the Charleston area. When they were brought to the Charleston area, 40% of them, many of them were dispersed across the corridor, but specifically to the Sea Island areas, because that's where the rice cultivation was occurring. On those islands, the history books also tell us that the first bridges were not built until the 1920s. So there really wasn't a way to get off and on those islands as they wanted to. So in this isolation, there was a birthing of a new culture, and not necessarily new, but the creation of a culture out of a situation that these people could not control. So they were systematically separated from their families, from their friends, from their tribes who spoke similar languages. And they were strategically separated from them in an effort to prevent them from being able to communicate in order to rebel. But in the isolation, they had to communicate, and they were able to preserve much of their African culture. So I wanted to show you this image just to give you a picture of some of the sea islands. This is the South Carolina Sea Islands, and in particular, paying attention to St. Helena Island, Johns Island, James Island, and Wadmalaw Island are some of the more well-known islands associated with Gullah Geechee. So while on these islands, you had the enslaved Africans who spoke multiple languages like Yoruba, Mende, Hintu, Kitsi, Twa, various other languages, who were, like I said, systematically separated, put together with different tribes who didn't speak the same language, but also forced to communicate with the people who owned them, who spoke English. And so in their brilliance, they created, or they pieced together parts of their African vernacular and mixed it with English to create what we call in linguistics a pidgin variety. A pidgin variety is a variety that we know is used to communicate for barter or for trade. However, this pidgin variety was then taught to their children and became their children's first language, where they didn't just speak English or the African variety, but they now solely spoke this new pidgin variety. That variety was then passed on from generation to generation to generation, creating what we know is the only English-based Creole variety, Gullah Geechee, spoken in the United States. Now, a lot of us are familiar with Creole varieties like Jamaican Creole, Guyanese Creole, which originate in Jamaica and Guyana. Then there's Cajun French Creole, which originates in Louisiana and is a French-based Creole. So Gullah is a diamond because it is the only documented English-based Creole in our English language vernacular. Gullah is uniquely American, proudly African, and we see here from Parkwall 2000, out of Africa, African influences in Atlantic Creoles, where there's a breakdown of the percentage of different languages on Gullah, where we see 40% Mende and 31% Bantu, 13% Atlantic, and so forth. But I love to see this because what it does is it gives us an idea of the percentage of the lexicon that is Gullah that comes directly from Africa. And the same here. So what's the difference? This is one of the questions that I get all the time when I do presentations. People are like, well, what's the difference between Gullah and Geechee? So historically, they trace the word Gullah back to Gola or Angola, Geechee to the Geechee people. Some people also make mention in the literature about the Ogeechee River and perhaps a connection between the Ogeechee River and the Geechee variety. There's also been some studies and some literature that talks about regional variation, where those who are on the sea islands may consider themselves or identify more as Gullah, while those more inland may identify more as Geechee. And then another theory is an age variation where older individuals who are closer to that basalectal original Gullah Geechee variety may identify more as speaking Gullah and may use more African words and vernacular, while those who may be a younger generation may more identify with Geechee, where they don't use as many African words, but may have incorporated now more of the American vernacular. So there's several theories that are out there in the literature, but overall, when I think about Gullah Geechee, I think about one people, one language, and one culture. There are certain cornerstones of our culture that I'd like to talk about that are really important for us: our family, our food, our religion. One of my favorite quotes, I quote this every time I do a presentation, from the Queen Quet, chiefess of the Gullah Geechee Nation. She says, "You must take care of the root for heal the tree." I love this because we as Gullah Geechee people value family, and we know that it is important that we take care of home. And so when we look back at the gentrification and the taking of our heirs' property and things like that, when I hear this quote, it reminds me of, I got to take care of the root. I have to take care of the home. I got to fix the issues to ensure that our language and our culture remains. So I love this quote by the Queen. All right, our food. Because we were isolated on those islands, we didn't necessarily have access to cows and pigs and things like that. So we ate a lot of what was available to our hands. We were on the water. So our diet is reflective of our space. So you see in our eating habits, we eat crab, shrimp, fish, anything really that comes out of the water. Also, as I mentioned earlier, we were brought here for our ability to engineer rice cultivating systems. And so in that same spirit, we eat rice. So what you're going to see here on the right-hand side is a dish called red rice, which scholars have linked back to jollof rice, which you can find in many African cultures today. So Gullah Geechee people in their isolation were able to even preserve culinary traditions from Africa that we still see in our cuisine today. And red rice is probably one of the most recognizable and in the literature traced back directly to Africa. Some traditional Gullah dishes that you'll also see, a lot of rice-based stuff, but we do a perlu. So on the left, you see okra perlu, which is rice, okra, shrimp, and bacon. You'll also see in the middle oysters, again, going back to our living off of the water. And then to the right, you see fish and grits. So again, back to the water and what we had access to. These are all placed on a Fanta basket of Sierra Leone, courtesy of the Avery Research Center as well. But this is where they would sift the rice and let it the whole fly away. The next cornerstone of our culture is religion. On the right, you see Moving Star Hall, one of the first praise houses on Johns Island, again, courtesy of Avery Research Center. And to the left, you will see Stewart Chapel United Methodist Church, which is my home church in Hughie, South Carolina. I put the two next to each other so that you can see, even though Moving Star Hall is small, the structure of the buildings resemble each other. Four-column porch with the pitch roof. And so across the corridor, you see similarities like this around our churches. But our churches became sort of a central location for us to gather and to pray. And in particular, one of the things that we were able to, cultural things that we were able to preserve is the watch night service, where we would come together in the praise house right before the new year. And the first iteration of this was to celebrate our freedom. Right. So it's Freedom's Eve. This is when the enslaved Africans were getting the news that they would be free. So at midnight, they celebrated. And we have preserved that within our culture. We gather for watch night service and we pray, and we have a watchman, and the watchman calls out the time and everybody together celebrates. And so that specific cultural tradition still exists within the Gullah Geechee culture. We also communicate a lot through music. We have what we call a polyrhythm in musical theory, is the use of two different rhythms at the same time that don't necessarily go together. So if you ever get a chance to join a Gullah Geechee service, you will notice that we do a clap like this. And so one person could be carrying that rhythm and then the other person will come in with another rhythm. And all of those sort of layer on to one another. Also, our songs carry meaning. My granddaddy used to sing a song, Benya, Benya, he bless my soul and he gone to glory, Benya, Benya, he bless my soul and he gone. And when he would sing that song, I asked him what he mean. He said, well, see, I couldn't tell them that somebody had been here and brought me something good. So I sang it. And when I sang it, they sang it back, a call and response. And I know they get the message that somebody been here. They bless us, and then he gone. And he said they would write songs that carry messages to sing out into the fields, to carry the message to all of the people. So our communication is rhythmic, it's musical, and it's rooted in religion. Something else that you will see that we've been able to preserve is our ring shout. And I'll just let you watch this video so that you can see how it looks. And this is from the McIntosh County Shouters. Now, remember when I said that little girl that I was and I didn't know that I was Gullah Geechee? I remember seeing the ushers in my church get in this circle just like this and go around, and they all went in the same way. They would hold hands in the church service, but I didn't recognize the significance of that within the Gullah culture until I started doing this work. And so it's always nice to see the ring shouters and to know that they are still preserving that. So as well in our culture, one of the most recognizable things is our sweetgrass baskets. So when we were in isolation, I mentioned this earlier, we were able to preserve so many things: food, culinary, language, and different, I wouldn't even say crafts, but different ways to use our hands that are directly tied back to Africa. So there's quilting that still happens across the corridor. But when you go downtown Charleston, Mount Pleasant, and various areas, you'll see women on the side of the road or in the marketplace making the sweetgrass baskets. And these resemble the exact baskets that you can still find right now in Africa. Somebody said this to me, and I thought this was beautifully stated. Gullah Geechee is the closest to Africa that you're going to get in the United States. And in particular, when you get down to those sea islands, you really breathe in and see and feel the closeness to African culture. On the right, you see my dad, myself, and my mom. And this is what we would do on the weekend. We would cast our net. We would go crabbing, fishing, and we would gather what we were going to eat and share with the community for that weekend. And so cultural traditions like this have been passed down, particularly on the sea islands. They would make their nets to cast out. That's a tradition that's been passed down, is actually making your own nets, going out to pick oysters. All of these things are things that we sort of grew up knowing and doing and being self-sufficient off of the land. I always like to share about the culture keepers because I think it's important that people should know who's doing the work, who are the people out here sharing the news about Gullah. So I'll share from my left to right. KJ Kearney's founder of Black Food Fridays. You can find him on Instagram. He doesn't necessarily only talk about Gullah Geechee, but he is Gullah Geechee. He started Red Rice Day down there in Charleston, but he's doing the nice work of preserving Black food practices. Then you have Ron Days of Gullah Gullah Island, who continues to do great work and recently published a few books. The Queen Quet, chiefess of the Gullah Geechee Nation. Queen has been doing this work for years, has represented us to the United Nations in multiple capacities, and a lot of her work today is on climate and preserving our land on the sea islands. And so it's important that we know these people and the work and the different facets of work that they are doing. Chef BJ Dennis, another culture keeper who is preserving our culture on the culinary side. His work really focuses on preserving some of those older traditional Gullah foods that people may not be cooking as often. I just watched a post from him recently where he was talking about chicken bog. And I hadn't heard that in a long time, but he's doing that work to keep to the forefront some of the Gullah Geechee food and culinary traditions that may be disappearing. Storyteller, Aunt Pearlie Sue, preserving our storytelling background. Now, Gullah Geechee people, we like to tell a good story. And so she has done that work to preserve that. So now let's spend the rest of our time together talking about the language. And I can tell you the truth because I like to tell the truth. If you speak Gullah Geechee, you is bilingual. What I mean? That means you can go back and forth like I do right now and speak one way, then you can turn it off and speak in another way. And I love to share this so that my audiences will understand the truth of who Gullah Geechee people are and the magnitude of our language. And so the same way we celebrate those who are bilingual Spanish, bilingual French, bilingual German, Gullah Geechee people too are bilingual. Some evidence of our bilingualness. In particular, I love to talk about our tense and negation. So let's jump into tense just a little bit. In Gullah, we do not mark past tense, regular or irregular. So in English, where the utterance would be, she walked home yesterday, in Gullah, he walked home yesterday. And you know it happened in the past because we say yesterday, and that's how you gonna know. But we did not have to put an ED on the end. Another irregular past tense option for us, instead of saying she rode the bike home, we keep it in regular, he ride the bike home yesterday. So you know that it happened in the past by the marker on the end. Present progressive tense. In Gullah, we do not say he is walking fast across the street. We say either walk fast across the street. And really say either walk fast across the road, because we really ain't gonna say street, or we say street, it could be street. But we don't necessarily mark that present progressive, put the INGs on the end. We also do not have to use the plural markers. So instead of saying, I want 3 donuts, we say, I want 3 donuts. And in Gullah, the substitution of the TH for the SH is an appropriate linguistic substitution. Also, possessives. So where in English, they would say, that's my mother's car. In Gullah, that's my mama's car. And so the possessiveness of whose car it is understood by who goes before it. So if I say that's Jessica's car, that's April's car, you understand whose car it belongs to without the marker of possession. It's really fascinating as a linguist when I really get down into the weeds of breaking down. And there's so much more that we do in terms of our tense and agreement, marking, and our phonology and our morphology, all of those things. But I just wanted to provide you with a few examples of some common ways that English marks tense that we don't, which when people speak to us, make it sometimes difficult for them to understand exactly what we're saying. So now let's talk about, remember I talked about Gullah was the language, the culture, and the people. So I want to introduce you to some language of the people. So when we talk about these things, so first is Bunya or Binya, depending on how people say it, but that means been here, or in particular, when I refer to a Binya, it's a Gullah Geechee descendant, somebody who is born of the culture. Then we have Kamyas, them the other people that are not originally from Gullah Geechee corridor but have made a home in the region. Churn or Chullin. So remember earlier when I talked about what's the difference between Gullah and Geechee, this is one of those words where you can kind of see some generational differences, where my granny would always say chillin', but my generation said churn. And she would tell us ain't churning, chillin'. And my mama wouldn't let us say churn. We had to say children. So it just depends on sort of where you're from, what area of the corridor you're from. Also depends on what word you use. Then it's Anna for you. And then Igal for girl, or Amen is also how you would hear them say woman for Amen. But a woman can also be referred to as a gal. So let's talk about the language of things. So things that occur in Gullah culture. So first is fush. So in Gullah, we don't say fish, we say fush. And the substitution of the short I, that's a phonological substitution that commonly occurs in the language. Short I is substituted for a U, So if we were to give you the word bill, I would never say I'm going to pay my bills. I can pay my bills, okay? Or going up the hill, we going up the hill. So always with that sound, but fush is one of those ones that are real common. The next one, cutter, is one that I always learned growing up and didn't learn until I was in kindergarten when they went to read the book, The Tortoise and the Hare. And I said, what is a tortoise? I didn't know what that was. I had no idea because where we were from, a turtle was a cutter. And so we had to make those connections growing up. The next, scrump, scrape, and scrawl. So according to Lorenzo Dow Turner's publication in 1949, Africanisms in the Gullah language, he documented that many of the African varieties in which Gullah Geechee derived didn't have the ST blend that didn't exist within their language. So when it came to saying words like shrimp, straw, and straight, because that blend didn't exist, we substituted for the scrump, scrawl, and scrape, the SK, which is a sound blend that occurs in multiple African languages. So that's really well documented in Lorenzo's book. Another phonological substitution that's well documented in his text as well is the W for V substitution. So rather than being vegetable, my granny used to say vegetable. And that U substitution sometimes also happens on the sound. This word right here, my mama said we couldn't see, but it's one of those words that everybody around said bunkie. And so buttocks. And then Frigidaire for refrigerator. And I know people are probably like, well, Frigidaire is a brand, but that's how the older generation referred to the refrigerator. We didn't know that it was a brand. That's just what we called that thing within our culture. Some other common phrases, some of them more well-known than others, and some of them have made their way into modern language, like bussin'. Is now a very common phrase across TikTok and other entities. In it. Now, some places, and I did a session recently where somebody was like, well, we say any. And I said, yeah. So my daddy says any, I say in it. Another lady, she's from the islands, and she also said in it. But in it is not ain't it. In it is like a confirmation. So if I were to say Idris Elba fine in it, it's like right, but it's definitely not a shortening of in it, of ain't it. Then you have cool red, meaning like wow. My granny used to say this word all the time, yeti, meaning to hear. Or she used to say, I can do them directly, meaning I'm going to do it in a minute. And she never said minute. It's again, I'm doing it in a minute, or I could do them directly. Then it's mine. Now, not mine like if that's mine, but like mind yourself now, or mind your mouth, child, for somebody who being sassy on the mouth. Mind yourself is how older individual would tell a child who was being sassy. Some other common phrases is E. Now, E, I write in my book, I categorize it as a universal pronoun. For in Gullah Geechee and other Creole varieties, there is no distinction between pronouns. So in English, the pronoun for he or she is he and she, but in Gullah, those two would be E. Okay, they is them or E, and it is also E. So where is my phone? Rather in Gullah, I would not say it's over there. I would say E over there. Where is Jessica? E right here. So E can symbolize persons or things. Another phrase is look ya, which is in the title of this presentation. One of the things you say, look ya, come ya, bun ya. But look ya meaning look here. Look over here. Okay. My mom and them used to say this one all the time. He takes sick, meaning he got sick. Or the hag ride him. And the hag was what we believe to sit on you when you were sleeping and you cannot move and you cannot breathe. Then we talk about a root, right? There are multiple people within our culture who practice in medicinal and medications from the earth, ways to heal yourself from the earth. And also, in other words, in Louisiana, they refer to it as like a root, or as voodoo. Similarly, we call it a root. So for us as root, we don't call it voodoo, but it's similar to what you would reference as voodoo in Louisiana. Some other grammar structures that I always like to highlight is we shorten phrases. So for example, going to becomes "g." So rather than saying I am going to the store, I could go to the store. Okay. Negation is also really interesting. So we shorten that as well. So rather than saying we are going or he is going, they are going, we shorten that contraction. We contract it to we ain't going, you ain't going, he ain't going, she ain't going, they ain't going, I ain't going, and they ain't going. And those are your standard Gullah Geechee negation linguistic structures. We also have intensifiers, so up and down. So if we want to say somebody is real crazy, we say that when they fool up now. And if we want to say they real crazy, that when they fool up down now. Okay, and so those intensifiers help us to signify when something is really, really bad or just a little bit bad or good or whatever you might be referring to. Then it's for. So I could do for you for. I talked about in it. Then we see this contraction of can't that's nasalized. So when we talk, we won't say I can't. We will not pronounce that T on it. Say I can. It's real nasal. I can do that. I can do that for you. Okay. Them for them, for them. See, I'm trying to code switch in the middle. Them for them and they for they. Again, well documented that TH construction was not something that was prevalent in multiple African languages. So therein lied that substitution of the D for the TH. And we see that across other words as well. We talked about churn. And then another common substitution is been for was, were, and went. So instead of saying I was there yesterday, I been there yesterday. We were at the grocery store, we been to the grocery store. We went to the concert, we been to the concert. And so you will see been substituted in all of those linguistic constructs. Some of my favorite phrases is bunya in the title of my book, tata. And I don't hear a lot of people talk about tata a lot. My grandmother, we used to call her tata. And I didn't quite know why, but then when I started reading Africanisms in the Gullah language, he talked about tata translating into sister in some African varieties. Directly is one of my favorite. Fush. Low put you got biggies. And what does that mean? Them churn hear everything. Little kids can hear a lot. And so we were growing up, little kids couldn't be in the presence of adults. That was a part of our culture. Little kids sat at a different table. You couldn't just be in conversation with an adult. You had to say, excuse me. All of those things are some cultural traditions. And then my mama said this one the other day, and I just thought it was the best thing since sliced bread. She was like, that one ain't nothing but a pine land rooter. I said, oh my God. What did you say? She said, yeah, ain't nothing but a pine land rooter. I said, what's the pine land rooter? She said, hog. Because down in the country, that's what they call the wild hogs who run around in the forest, which where we live is full of pine trees. So we call them a pine land rooter. And I loved when she shared those. So we have a really unique, meaningful opportunity to have conversations like this, to learn about the basics of what Gullah is, who we are, the historical context of where we come from, and then what are those language and linguistic features that are being preserved, that are still being preserved and are still being used today. So we can still have these conversations. We can still be advocates to talk about what is the impact of integration and gentrification on cultural preservation, and what are some creative ways to engage in preservation efforts. When those surveys come out, when the petitions come out, when they're trying to take land on St. Helena, or they're trying to do something regarding heirs property, take advantage of clicking on those links, signing those petitions, figuring out how you can help the people who are doing the work to continue to advocate for preserving Gullah culture. Here are a couple resources by way of children's books. These are some books, other Gullah cultural books. One of my favorites is When Roots Die by Patricia Jones Jackson. It's a really great book. The Language You Cry In, and these are a couple movies, Daughters of the Dust. A couple other resources, a couple websites for you to visit. In particular, Gullah Geechee Know-It-All, if you have little ones and you're interested in the stories, those are housed there. And then a lot of the happenings across the corridor in terms of events can be found at gullahgeecheecorridor.org. If you have any questions for me, I am happy to take them at this time. And these are the ways that you can connect with me beyond this space. I have absolutely enjoyed talking to you all today.
Thank you so much, Dr. Berry. We did have a few questions that came in while you were presenting. One of them came in our chat right at the beginning of your talk. And this one would you consider yourself bilingual or just someone who speaks two different forms of English?
I consider myself bilingual. I do. Because when I speak Gullah Geechee in its truest form, when I get around my family, those who don't speak Gullah Geechee will not understand. They will need translation. And that is true of, for example, my husband. When he speaks to my dad and when he gets around my family, he has no idea what we're saying. He's from Orangeburg, South Carolina. He's African American. But when he's around us, when we speak Gullah in our fullest, it is unintelligible to those who don't speak the language. So I honestly 100% say I am bilingual, and I encourage those who speak the language to own that title as well.
Okay. And I think that touches a little bit also when in your presentation, you mentioned about code switching, and you did it kind of without thinking about it as you switched from quote standardized English to the Gullah Geechee language. So how often do the Gullah Geechee have to code switch in their daily life?
Great question. We code switch often, all the time, actually. And one of the things when I talked about Gullah being isolated, what it did is it also created the language is insular. And I hope that's making sense. So the language is insular in that we almost don't speak it unless we kind of know somebody in the room speaks it as well. We weren't taught directly, like, don't speak Gullah in public, but because of the negative perception of the language, we ended up sort of not speaking it out in the world. And so I forget where I'm going with that, but yeah.
So code switching is very, very
yes,
common practice for
it is. Because people don't understand us when we speak Gullah in its truest form, we've almost been forced to code switch in order to facilitate communication. I think that it's very recent that Gullah Geechee people are feeling confident that, maybe I don't have to code switch as much as I used to, because I am now sort of owning this identity, and there are other people who are outwardly owning their variety in public. But again, generational, and I think that's where I was getting to, that generational sort of idea of Gullah was negative. It wasn't a positive thing to be considered Gullah Geechee. And so we kind of protected it. And so, yes, we have to code switch, and we do it almost without thinking, and majority of the time without direct instruction. So the way I learned to code switch was my mama had a different voice when she got on the phone with the bill collector. She would be like, Jessica Courtney, Lacey, I ready for y'all to come down, y'all. And then somebody rings the phone and she's like, hello. And so we watched her use a different voice. And so we in turn mirrored what she was doing without fully understanding why we were doing that. We just knew if we used our Gullah home voice, people may not understand us out in the world.
Mhm. Okay. So one of the other questions was, given the African linguistic retentions in Gullah and Geechee, is there a justification for providing ESOL programs for Gullah descendant students? Would this be an advantage or disadvantage? And how can we promote this policy change? Three-part question there.
Woo, whoever asked that question, thank you. The answer is it's a resounding yes. I think that there needs to be accommodations. I think my only reserve about ESOL, because nobody's really been able to quite answer this question, is because Gullah is English based and the assessments that are given in English, will the kids score low enough to qualify for the services? And so while I think the services will be beneficial to the children based on the standards for qualification of the services, I'm not certain the kids will qualify. So there needs to be conversations about what modifications to assessments need to be made in order for the kids to be able to qualify. And if they won't qualify, are districts willing to create accommodations for kids who speak Gullah? Because they need that. They're speaking a different language. They're coming into the school systems, navigating that shift, and without direct instruction. So I 100% believe that ESOL services will be an asset, but I'm not sure if anybody's thought about it in terms of Gullah Geechee children really being able to qualify. And so I think that's a open-ended question that should be explored for sure.
And do you see that happening in the South Carolina area, that the ESOL classes could be offered to Gullah Geechee descendants? No, not at all.
Not yet.
Okay. I didn't think that this was happening in Georgia, but I wasn't sure there directly in South Carolina with that. Right.
I think again, when I talk about opportunity, I think that is a wide open opportunity for conversations about what that might look like.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. And it looks like we have maybe two more questions coming in. Also, Dr. Berry, who are these people that will make assessments if our language is taken into schools? Most teachers do not speak Gullah or Geechee fluently. And this is from Queen Quat. And she says, thank you.
Yeah, she said, who will make these assessments?
Right. Who are these people that will make?
Who are the people? Well, I think that the assessments in ESOL already exist. I think that they would need to tap into local experts to come up with the modifications that would help them to be able to identify the kids that need the most assistance. So in that event, there are a couple like speech language pathologists that I know of who are native Gullah Geechee that I would say, maybe perhaps there needs to be an ad hoc committee, bringing in native scholars like Queen Quet, bringing in a few other people who can look at these assessments and say, hey, these are places where our kids, will do fine. And then here are places where you might want to switch the stimuli in this way. But I wouldn't leave it at all to the educators, because we know that a lot of them are moving into our coastal areas. And I talked about that at the beginning of the session, the gentrification, the influx of people into our regions. They certainly would not be able to speak to that. So whoever is creating it will need to tap into local native language resources to get the most accurate picture of how kids will respond, what responses are truly Gullah Geechee, which responses are in error, and how we can, accommodate the kids within learning.
All right. Well, I don't see any other questions. So Dr. Jessica Berry, thank you so much again for giving us this great presentation and sharing just a little bit about the culture. I know there's so much more, but I think we're at a good starting point to expand our knowledge about it. So thank you again for joining Gwinnett County Public Library, and we hope to hear from you soon.
Thank you for having me. Thank you everyone for joining.